Once upon a time in a faraway land. What do those words do for you? If you're like most people, they give you a little bump of excitement because your brain thinks it's in for a treat. But stories are much more than just a feel-good way to pass the time. Stories can actually become one of the most powerful teaching tools there is. In this video, we're going to discover why stories are so powerful, learn several useful story categories, and learn how to guarantee that the stories we tell are engaging and strong every time. So let's get started. Now, before we begin, let's address an important question. First, why tell stories? I mean, sure, they're fun, but if we're strapped for time as teachers, wouldn't it be better to skip the story in favor of our content? I know I've struggled with that thought before, and it's a good question. But allow me to explain it like this. During my growing up years, my grandparents owned a lovable beagle named Charlie. He was one of the highlights of our visit, second only by us getting to play their ancient Nintendo for hours at a time. You know the type, we had to blow him like this? You know what I'm talking about. Now, eventually Charlie, as he got older, he needed to take medicine regularly. Now, my pop-up had a couple of options. He could catch Charlie, wrestle his jaws open, shove the pill down his throat, hold the mouth closed until Charlie had swallowed it, all with him resisting the whole time. Or he could hide that medicine in the middle of a spoonful of peanut butter, which was Charlie's favorite, and have Charlie come willingly to lick the spoon clean, medicine and all. Now, of course, Pop-Up chose the second option. Okay, so what's the point? The point is stories can go where lectures cannot. Sometimes kids will resist getting preached to, but they'll willingly be drawn to the same truth when it's presented in an engaging story. And for that reason, stories are worth the time. Stories are the perfect teaching tool for several good reasons. First, they are the easiest way to glean information. Because stories are so full of imagery and parallels, new concepts and ideas can be easily understood and transferred by linking what's unknown to what's already known. They also resonate with people. Everybody loves a good story, and we're all part of the story of our own lives, so everybody can relate at least at some level. Stories are engaging. Good stories are fun. And when your students are having fun, learning becomes a breeze. You can use stories to help make your teaching easier. And stories are memorable. Because of how stories are structured, they have built-in attributes that keep them memorable. Now, this of course increases the likelihood of your core message being retained and acted on. And stories are disarming. You can pack a pretty powerful punch without singling anybody out when you use a story. So stories are a good idea for teaching. Now, in the next few videos, we're going to answer two important questions about stories. First off, how do I find or create good stories? And then second, how do I tell good stories really well? Now, we're gonna tackle the first question here and in the next video. So how do I find or create good stories? The truth is, stories are everywhere. Good stories are not. Now, 2 steps to finding or creating a good story is first, you wanna know your message. You wanna begin with the end in mind. Don't just go searching for inspiring, emotional, or funny stories and then try and shoehorn them into your lesson. First, know which point you're trying to get across, and then find or create a story to match. Here are a few story types to help get you thinking on the right track. First, we have the challenge plot. This is your classic underdog, rags to riches, man against the odds, struggle, and ultimately overcome story. David and Goliath is a great example of the challenge plot. This appeals to our determination and our courage, and it inspires us to action. Next, you have the connection plot. This is about building bridges, bridging gaps, whether it's racial, social, economical, etc. It encourages friendship, love, compassion, and brotherhood. The Good Samaritan is a great example of the connection plot. This inspires us to help, to love, to work with, and to appreciate each other more. And then you've got the creativity plot. This is about solving a problem or a mystery. It's about breakthrough or eureka moments. The creativity plot makes us want to do something different, to try new things and to be creative. Newton and the apple is a great example. Now, this one might be a little bit harder to pick out alone because it's often in combination with one of the other plots. Now, knowing about these basic plots can help you spot the right kind of story that you need or want for what it is you're trying to teach. So ask yourself, what am I trying to convey? And then see if you can bring out the themes of the story to match your point. Number 2, have a solid plot structure. Okay, so you found a story that aligns with your point, but now what? Well, now it's time to kick the tires to make sure the story has good bones. In other words, that it's interesting, that it's powerful, that it's engaging and well-paced and things like that. See, it's not enough to find a boring story that matches your point. Of course, you also want it to be a good story, one that will stick with people because it's exciting. But how do we know if this story has what it takes? A simple way to find out is to put the story through a proven template or filter known as a story plot. A story plot is kind of like the blueprint for your story. So in theory, if the structure is right on paper, then it's going to be right when it's time to tell your story. There are many different story plot structures, but today we're just going to focus on one well-known one called the 3-act story plot. This one's pretty simple, but it's also fairly universal, so it's going to be useful for us. Now, as you might have guessed, this plot structure is made up of 3 different parts, each part having 3 different main plots. Now, we're going to use the story of Joseph as an example as we follow along. Act 1. Exposition explains what ordinary life was like before the story really begins. So with Joseph, it would just be him living with his parents and his brothers. The inciting incident. This is the event that gets the story started. So for Joseph, it could be when he receives his coat, it could be his dreams, or a more dramatic point of the story would be when his brothers throw him into the pit. Plot point 1. This is where the adventure really begins with no going back. So for better or worse, our hero is committed. For Joseph, it's when he is sold and taken away, and thus his misadventure has begun. Act 2. Rising action. This part is about roadblocks, friends, and enemies, and making progress towards the goal. So for Joseph, being taken to a new country as a slave is a pretty big roadblock, and the Bible tells us about Potiphar and his wife, and Joseph starts moving up the ranks. Midpoint. This is where there's a clear before or after. This is when something happens that changes everything. It's kind of like a second inciting event, and it's usually bad. For Joseph, this is when he's framed and sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Plot point 2. This is about evaluation and sort of gathering of thought and renewed commitment towards the goal. Now, the Bible doesn't say what Joseph was thinking while he was in prison, but it's easy to assume that he must have renewed his faith in God at this point, because we see that he was choosing to serve in the prison instead of becoming bitter. Act 3, pre-climax, also known as the false climax. This is where the foe is engaged, but the outcome is uncertain. So in this case, after revealing the meaning of the chief butler's dream, it looks like Joseph might finally be let out of prison, but hopes get dashed as 2 more years pass. The climax. This is the height of the story. This is where the foe is defeated and finally the objective has been reached. For Joseph, this is when he's finally recognized and brought to the king, where he is promoted to co-ruler of the country. The climax tops out as his brothers bow to him, fulfilling the dreams that started it all. The denouement. Also called the resolution. Things are resolved and the world goes back to normal, but now it's a new normal. This is where Joseph reconciles with his brothers and they all return to living together, but now Joseph is a powerful ruler and his family lives with him in Egypt. By understanding this basic structure, it becomes much easier to guarantee that you're going to be including the right parts of the story. Try this out for yourself. Take a recent event in your life and run it through this framework. Now, it might not fit exactly, and that's okay, but you might be surprised how much this ordinary event starts sounding like a real story. Also, simpler or shorter stories are going to have fewer plot points, and that's okay. By emphasizing certain story facts over others, you can create a strong story structure that naturally builds on the things that people like most about stories. Now, you have your blueprint. How exactly do you start building your story? Check out this next video to work through the building materials of a great story.